The Chicago Bears will either have one of the best offensive lines in the NFL this season or a massive disappointment due to injuries, and I don't really see any in between.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today, and hopefully each and every day. Because on the show today, I want to look at where this Bears offensive line stacks up with the rest of the NFL. Pro Football Focus ranked the NFL offensive lines and put them in the top 5, which I think we can all see the path there and why PFF and others can be excited about this Bears offensive line, but I want to kind of go through what makes them a top 5 offensive line, but then also where I think the real possibility of underwhelming and underachieving on the offensive line and having further problems there that we thought would be solved this offseason that maybe weren't ultimately solved. And then I kind of want to put them head to head with some of the other top offensive lines in the NFL to kind of get a sense of where they land in this sort of precarious position between, I don't want to say boom or bust, but certainly between solved and same old issues. It's probably the better dichotomy to put there. But PFF's offensive line rankings put the Chicago Bears at number 4, with 3 teams ahead of them: the Philadelphia Eagles, the Denver Broncos, and the Buffalo Bills. They're just ahead of the Indianapolis Colts, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Minnesota Vikings, Atlanta Falcons, New York Jets, and Los Angeles Chargers. And it's interesting that we thought of the Lions having one of the best offensive lines in football with Ben Johnson, and yet you swap out, I guess their center retired, and then they lost Kevin Zeitler in free agency, and now all of a sudden, not in the top 10. I think they're still well rated by PFF in their article, and even the Packers were high in this list. If you look around the NFC North, it was a well-regarded offensive line group. The Lions were at 13, and the Packers were at 14. So all 4 NFC North teams in the top half of the league in terms of offensive line in PFF's rankings. But it feels almost shocking to see the Bears viewed as a top 5 anything, especially not defense, but specifically a top 5 offensive line, the position group that's been the bane of all of our existences for pretty much, my entire lifetime. I don't know. They had a couple years with good offensive lines during the Lovie Smith era, but it's been a good decade or two since consistent offensive line play has been a thing in Chicago. And that was such an emphasis of Ryan Poles this offseason in a way that it feels like the last 2 or 3 general managers haven't done, trading for Joe Thuney and Jonah Jackson, signing Drew Dalman, drafting Ozzie Trapillo in the second round. Like, it was a very clear investment in that position to try and build them up to be a top 5 group. And so entering 2025, they're already being viewed in that light. And I think it's easy to sort of see how this group goes through this season and emerges and maintains as a top 5 offensive line. If you think about Joe Thuney right away at left guard, he's been a Pro Bowler the last 3 years in a row and a number of times throughout his career. Like, he adds instant credibility and leadership and shores up that spot that hasn't been missing in talent, but just missing in durability with Tevin Jenkins the last few seasons. But that's obviously, even when healthy, Joe Thuney's a better player than Tevin Jenkins. And then the fact that Thuney doesn't miss time is also a huge upgrade over what the Bears had with Tevin Jenkins there. Drew Dalman at center is not as durable perhaps as Coleman Shelton was last season, but clearly a much better center and a clear upgrade there. Someone who's a more consistent, effective run blocker who can get out in space and run the outside zone type of plays that Ben Johnson wants to predicate his offense around in the ground game. Like, the run game upgrade is going to be massive there. And then he's also a more consistent pass rusher as well. That's why you go out and make Drew Dalman the highest paid center in football. Jonah Jackson, you can see him getting back to the Pro Bowl level. We saw him play with Ben Johnson in Detroit, despite the last year and with the Rams not going particularly well, I think there's an understanding that you put him back at one position, you kind of let him focus just there, and now get him back with the same offensive coach, and that he can get back to that level of play. And then, Darnell Wright, we know, is a solid right tackle. We'll see who wins the Bears left tackle battle, but presumably probably still going to be Braxton Jones if he gets healthy here quickly at the beginning of training camp. And you feel like those are both fine offensive tackles. So if you have a much, much upgraded interior with really solid tackles on the edge, you can feel like it's a really solid group across the board, all 5 players. And I think a big part of why the Bears get to be a top 5 offensive line here isn't even purely about the player upgrades they made, but the impact that Ben Johnson will have on the offensive line. Now, to be clear, like PFF didn't cite this specifically in the rankings, but I think for me personally, if I'm trying to make the case as to why the Bears are going to have a top 5 offensive line this season, all the player upgrades, of course, but then also an offensive coach who will put them in a better position to be successful, who will call plays in a sequence and order that sets up future plays, that distracts and confuses opposing defenses so it's less clear and predictable what the offensive line is going to be doing on any play, and mixing play action in there, right? And then play action can help the pass protection, right? And the running game can help the pass protection, and leaving tight ends and the amount of tight ends that Ben Johnson's going to use, right? All the different ways that he will run this offense will make everyone's job easier, including the offensive lines. And that was kind of one of the debates last year with the Bears offensive line, is how bad was the offensive line versus how bad was it the offensive play calling, and maybe Caleb Williams holding onto the ball too long and making the offensive line's job easier or more difficult. You will have eliminated most, if not all of that, by adding Ben Johnson. Maybe the Caleb Williams holding the ball thing is still a question, but in theory, Ben Johnson is supposed to improve that as well. So I think we'll really get a sense of like the pure talent of this offensive line being squeezed to the maximum. And then we'll get a sense of like, are these players really good enough, or are they getting as much as they can out of them and it's still not good enough? But I think when you have former Pro Bowler in Jonah Jackson, a Pro Bowler in Joe Thuney, and guys like Braxton Jones, Dalman, and Darnell Wright that are like above average players at their positions, it's pretty easy to talk yourself into this O-line being a top 5 group this upcoming season. Now, that being said, I think I can also talk myself into this group not living up to those top 5 expectations. I think back to last season when we spent a lot of the offseason. Remember the Bears defense was talking about how we're going to be a top 5 defense in the NFL. We're going to be a top 5 defense. We're a top 5 group. And then, of course, they finished 13th in points and 27th in yards. And just because you have a really talented group on paper and a good roster that you feel like is going to be good doesn't always mean it plays out that way. I think there's a little more security in this Bears offensive line, but the path to them failing is also, let's say, clear. I'm not going to say likely, but like obvious, right? You don't have to sort of like make up hypotheticals and bend over backwards to find the exact right scenarios where the offensive line might not be as good as you thought it was, because there's some recent history with more than half of these guys that suggests like, hey, maybe you should be prepared just in case things don't go quite the way you want them to. So we'll look at the other end of this as like, okay, if that was the best case scenario, here's how they're a top 5 group. What's kind of the opposite side of that spectrum? I don't want to say worst case scenario, but how could things go awry with this Bears offensive line and not be as solved as maybe we think they are? Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting, because you're already following the action, so why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned on the beach. It's easy to use, fast to pay out, and makes even regular season games feel like must-watch events. Even if you want to bet ahead on the upcoming football season, you can bet on Bears-Vikings Week 1, Caleb Williams' passing yardage, prop total, Ben Johnson's odds to win head coach of the year, and so much more, all in the FanDuel app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. And if you're new to FanDuel, now's a great time to get started, because new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. It's easy to get excited about this Bears offensive line and see all of the additions and changes that Ryan Poles made, resulting in a top 5 offensive line. And in all likelihood, the most likely outcome here is that the Bears offensive line is much improved. But as you look at these players individually, you can start to see some of the cracks here. And I'm always just hesitant with this because of how much we talk about the Bears being, they're always the offseason champions, right? Every 3 or 4 years in a row, it feels like the Bears won the offseason for all the great moves that they made. And of course, each of the last handful of seasons, when you get to the regular season, all of those great moves in the offseason didn't end up turning out to be great moves. And we look back and we're like, well, what the heck, what went wrong? Why didn't we see this coming? Or why did we think they would be great when they ultimately weren't great? And I think there's still some benefit of the doubt that the Bears have to regain, even though it's, new coaching staff, and that's really supposed to be the big difference maker here. But nonetheless, we've been really excited about even offensive line additions before. You're hard pressed to find Bears fans that were disappointed when they signed Nate Davis as a free agent from the Tennessee Titans. He had been a pretty consistent player for them, and he marked like a veteran, significant upgrade in the offensive line. And of course, that proved to be an absolutely disastrous free agent signing. And so just because it looks great in March, April, May, June, July, doesn't always mean it ends up being great on the field in the regular season. I don't think this applies to Joe Thuney. I think that is as safe and secure and strong of a trade and an offensive line upgrade as you can possibly find. There's no reason to think anything will go wrong with Joe Thuney, and anything that does go wrong with Joe Thuney is completely just bad luck and not something that should have been able to see coming or whatever it might be. There's no reason to doubt Joe Thuney's going to be an excellent Pro Bowl caliber offensive lineman for the Chicago Bears this season. I think there's generally no reason to doubt that Darnell Wright will continue to play at a high level. Maybe not a Pro Bowl right tackle just yet, but we've seen him be durable, be reliable, maybe takes a step forward, but you're not going to get worse. So you're not going to get bad right tackle play. I think we know those two spots are about as secure and solid as you could hope for. I have really no doubts about what's going to transpire at those positions. The other 3 all have question marks of varying severity, varying size. Let's start with the biggest one. The obvious one is Jonah Jackson at right guard. We talked about this a little bit on Monday's podcast when we talked about the Bears needing more offensive line depth. But Jonah Jackson played 4 games last season for the Rams. The year before that, he played 12 games for the Detroit Lions. The year before that, he played 13 games for the Detroit Lions. So he has missed 4 games, 5 games, and 13 games across each of the last 3 seasons. When a guy misses a quarter plus of the season in 3 years in a row, is it not wise to expect he might miss a quarter of the season again this year? If that's kind of sort of the minimum he's missed in each of the last 3 seasons, we don't have any real reason to think all of a sudden he's going to just be more durable again. I mean, it's a lot of it can be luck and random chance and all that stuff, but just as though we don't have any reason to think he'll get hurt, we don't have a lot of recent track record. It's been more often than not that he's going to be injured and missing some games as opposed to finishing the season in full. And so depending on Jonah Jackson's durability, that can go a long way towards this Bears offensive line being a top 5 group or being a group that still needs some improvement. And I think generally, if Jonah Jackson is the only injury you deal with on the offensive line this season, so you got, Braxton Jones, Joe Thuney, Drew Dalman, and then maybe Ryan Bates fills in at right guard, and then Darnell Wright, your offensive line is still going to be a really good group. I think it could still even be a top 5 group, even if Jonah Jackson is missing some time with injury. One spot there is not the end of the world. But then you look next to him with Drew Dalman, another guy we talked a little bit about on Monday, so I'm not going to rehash the whole thing, but last season, Drew Dalman played 9 games. The year before that, he played 14 games. So that is 11 games missed across the last 2 seasons. It's not as consistent as Jonah Jackson. It's not as concerning as Jonah Jackson's injury history, but the difference with Drew Dalman is that both seasons have been ankle injuries. Jackson's been a combination of a bunch of different stuff that kind of feels a little bit like bad luck or whatever it might be, whereas when it's been the same thing for Drew Dalman in multiple years, you wonder, is that going to continue to be a recurring thing, or is it completely behind him? We just don't know. So if if Jonah Jackson is missing some games and Drew Dalman is missing some games, now all of a sudden you have a real problem on your interior. Even if Joe Thuney is still playing great, and even if Darnell Wright is still playing great, if you've got a couple backups on the interior offensive line, you're just not going to be a very good offensive line. And that pressure up the middle can be really disruptive to Caleb Williams. It can blow up running games. It can throw off the play action. And certainly the center is going to be responsible for calling the protection. So getting a veteran player in there would be important in that situation. Like you have two of your key additions on the interior with real injury histories. Now, injury history does not guarantee injury in the present, but it doesn't leave you as confident or as secure as someone like Jonah Jackson or Drew Dalman. Then we get to left tackle, where I think when healthy, Braxton Jones is a really good offensive lineman, and all these guys are really good offensive linemen when healthy. But we've seen now Braxton Jones the last 2 seasons, 12 games in 2024, 11 games in 2023. He's playing 2/3 of the season, missing 5 and 6 games each of the last 2 years. Now, maybe it's all behind him, but it isn't even currently behind him because he's still recovering from surgery from one of those injuries. And so is he going to be able to be out there all season, or are you going to instead start a rookie left tackle in Ozzie Trapillo, or maybe midway through the season if Jones gets hurt, put in a rookie left tackle in Ozzie Trapillo, and then you're gambling on how good he is right away. And I think there's an understanding with Trapillo that the floor is decently high, he's got good technique, and he should be able to hold his own. But you also know that opposing defensive coordinators will see a rookie on the offensive line, and they'll say, let's attack that. Let's blitz that. Let's stunt there. Let's test his communication. Let's find who we think might be the weak link and be able to take advantage. And if Ozzie Trapillo is your only weak link, you're doing fine. Of course, yeah, if you got Joe Thuney next to him and Drew Dalman and Jonah Jackson are fine in the interior, you can mask one bad offensive lineman, not even bad for Ozzie Trapillo, but you can mask one question mark on the offensive line. But when you start to stack these up a little bit, you're kind of left just hoping that they don't happen at the same time, that maybe Jonah Jackson misses a few games early in the season and then comes back, and then maybe Drew Dalman misses a few games later in the season and then comes back, but you're not having multiple guys out at the same time. Or you can see the alternative, like we did with the Bears offensive line last season and in previous Bears seasons, where you have backups at multiple positions because multiple players are hurt at the same time. And then sometimes those backups are hurt. So you've got a third stringer like Doug Kramer or Bill Murray coming in the game. And that's when the offensive line troubles become real. Not because they didn't do a good enough job of getting better starters, but just because the starters that they got come with some amount of injury history and concern. And that to me is what is the biggest obstacle that could keep the Chicago Bears from having a top 5 offensive line in 2025. Hopefully they're all healthy. We know statistically, no team has all 5 offensive linemen play every single snap. There's going to be times when some of these offensive linemen are out, but the less time they're out, the closer the Bears will be to a top 5 group. And the more time they're out, the more that position group could still continue to be a problem. And it's kind of what I'm afraid of based on recent years of these players' individual seasons and missing games, and then also recent years of Bears offensive lines having injuries there. There's just a combination of bad Bears luck plus bad luck of these players. It makes me just a little nervous as everyone comes together here. But that's going to be true for other offensive lines as well, right? Every team is going to deal with injuries up front, and their ability to fill them in is key to their success. And also just every team, other teams have offensive linemen with their own types of question marks on them. So I want to compare this Bears starting 5 and some of the questions that surround those players with some of the other top offensive lines in PFF's offensive line top 10 ranking here next on Locked On Bears. So I think sometimes when we talk about the injury concerns for the Bears offensive line, or Bears at any kind of position, I think we have this this tendency to kind of subconsciously assume, or I guess maybe forget that other teams will deal with injuries too, and other teams have those same types of injury questions in their own different ways and implications for their team, right? They don't all have the exact complications of Jonah Jackson and Drew Dalman and Braxton Jones or whatever, but you do have every team with their own questions about what that's going to look like for them. And so I think it's important to kind of put the Bears' questions into context there with some of the other offensive lines ranked highly in this group. And so we mentioned at the front end, the top 5 there was going to be the Eagles, the Broncos, the Bills, the Bears, and the Indianapolis Colts. Let's start with those 5 offensive lines in particular. you've got sort of an understanding that the Eagles have a great offensive line because they have one of the best offensive line coaches and they've invested a ton of draft picks in the offensive line. And yet at the same time, we have seen that group slowly turn over, we'll say. I was going to say bleed talent, but that feels like a strong phrase. But like this past offseason, Mekhi Becton, their right guard, left in free agency. We saw, how recently did Travis Kelce, or excuse me, Jason Kelce, I should say, retire from that offensive line. So they've gone to younger players. So they've got, Cam Jurgens, their second round pick from 2022, starting at center. Tyler Steen at right guard is their third round pick. And we can't be too many more years before Lane Johnson at right tackle is going to have to retire at some point here. He's over 35 now and working his way up. But like, it's not as though all five of those starters on the Eagles offensive line are blue chip studs. Like, we haven't seen Tyler Steen in particular play that well in the NFL. He hasn't played a ton, but we haven't seen him play particularly well when he has been out on the field. I think he had like 300, 400-ish snaps last season and had some real ups and downs there. Even Cam Jurgens on the interior is no Jason Kelce. Like, he's been fine, but he's not great. I think their tackle play has been phenomenal. But like, even the number one ranked offensive line but you can't find too many people that disagree about the Eagles having a great offensive line. They got questions right there at the right guard spot. And I don't know that center's a question, but it's just perhaps not as good as it has been in the past, and yet they could still be a number one offensive line. I think similar kind of conversation for the Denver Broncos, who come in second here. Like, we know their tackles, Garrett Bowles and Mike McGlinchey, are really good, older, veteran players. I love their right guard, Quinn Miners, was a third-round pick who's been an absolute stud for them. But like, at center, I don't know that Luke Wattenberg, their fifth-round pick from a couple years ago, is really all that great. I mean, he's not terrible, but I wouldn't say he's all that great. And then even at left guard, someone like Ben Powers, I think, has been fine, but I don't think of Ben Powers as being like some, Pro Bowl game-changing offensive lineman for them. Like, he was okay for the Ravens, and he's come over to the Broncos and been fine. Like, it's not a group that's loaded with studs. And so, like, you can kind of compare side by side, even just those two teams. Like, okay, Eagles got a question at right guard, Broncos center and left guard are a little bit iffy, but like, for the Bears, when healthy, I mean, they might have a better offensive line than those five. I mean, maybe your biggest question is left tackle. That's kind of the one spot that you're not sure how great it's going to be. But I think Braxton Jones might be better than Tyler Steen of the Eagles at right guard. I mean, not a guard versus a right guard, or sorry, a left tackle versus a right guard. It's not a super fair comparison. And so, like, it's kind of hard to stack it up and say, okay, like, who's got the better offensive line? Well, like, the Eagles have better tackles, but the Bears have better guards and center, and so how you sort of match that up? And same thing with the Broncos having good tackles and a really good right guard, like, and they're a young ascending group on the interior there, so you feel like there's some progress there. But part of that is just the nature of the beast here, and how well the Bears can stay healthy will go a long way towards how those offensive lines are viewed in comparisons. It helps that they have all five of their starting offensive linemen from last year coming back for this season. That continuity will go a long way. Same thing is true for the Buffalo Bills, who are third, the only other team ahead of the Bears on this list, with Deion Dawkins at left tackle. They brought in, or a couple years ago, they brought over David Edwards from the Los Angeles Rams to play left guard. Connor McGovern is their center. Osiris Torrance at right guard, and then Spencer Brown at right tackle. Like to me, the Bills' offensive line doesn't jump out as like absolutely stacked and loaded with just elite talent from left to right, but to me, it's just like a really, really solid group. Like, that's not a group that you have a lot of question marks about. Like, I don't know that there's a ton of like Pro Bowl play you're getting, but you're getting a ton of very good. It's like, oh yeah, like Spencer Brown's a very good right tackle. Deion Dawkins is a pretty good left tackle. He has a lot of penalties, but it's you can survive with that. Connor McGovern's a good center. Like, David Edwards has been a good guard. Osiris Torrance is probably the weak link there, but even him, like, he's been reliable and durable and a consistent force within the last two seasons, and still a younger player who's ascending. So you feel like he can grow into an even bigger role there. And it's like, okay, yeah, you can kind of see where maybe the Bills' offensive line doesn't have nearly as high a ceiling as what the Bears' offensive line can be, with Tooney as a potential Pro Bowler, and I think Dalman has Pro Bowl capabilities. Jonah Jackson has Pro Bowl capabilities. If Darnell Wright takes a step forward, right, you can talk yourself into this Bears offensive line being really, really good if everyone hits their ceiling. I don't think the Bills' offensive line has that same ceiling, but they just have a much, much higher floor of like five dependable, reliable guys that you can count on every week, and that's what the Bears hope they have, but they still need to prove their dependability and reliability and availability in that same way. And I think that's what kind of keeps them from jumping up higher, even higher towards the top of this list. I think the Indianapolis Colts right behind the Bears at 5 have a similar volatility just because of how young they are. Bernard Ryman at left tackle was a draft pick a couple of years ago. Quentin Nelson's their oldest. Well, Quentin Nelson and Braden Smith, their left guard and right tackle, are the oldest guys, but they were drafted in 2018. They're not even over 30 yet. And then 2 rookies last year, Tanner Bortolini and Matt Gonkovs, are taking over as starters on the interior there. Like, you can see those young offensive linemen taking a step forward and being really, really good, or you can see them struggling in year 2 and trying to adapt and adjust and grow and maybe not quite be as good as the Colts need them. But I think there's enough of a ceiling there to have them ranked highly, because you feel like we've seen those rookies, or they're now second-year players, those young guys play pretty well, and it's just a matter of how much of a step forward they can take. So that's why I think we can feel comfortable with the Bears kind of right here in this range of one of the better offensive lines that can absolutely be great. Maybe there's a little bit more risk than some of these other lines of things not going well, but boy, a lot is going to be hinging on their health and durability over the course of the season. That's why I will again say what we said on Monday is get better offensive line depth, better backups, particularly on the interior. If you feel like Trapillo and Braxton Jones can kind of be the starting left tackle and swing tackle on the outside, get better interior offensive linemen just in case. You hope that you never need them and you don't even have to put a backup in there because your interior stays healthy all season, but you'd rather be prepared for the worst as opposed to being blindsided if you have to have a couple of backups in there and all of a sudden Doug Kramer and Bill Murray are playing meaningful snaps again. It feels like the offensive line is kind of where we started last season with that group. So hopefully they puts this offensive line into more context of what the floor and the ceiling looks like and just how great they can be and just how maybe not everything is perfectly situated just yet. If the Bears do make any additions to the backups on the offensive line, you can be sure we'll break it down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you're looking for a second listen, you can always check out any of our other Locked On Podcast Network podcasts for all of your favorite teams in the NBA, MLB, NHL, and college sports across the country. We've got Locked On podcasts for you all over this network. They all do a great job. So go check out another Locked On podcast for your second listen today. Coming back on Monday, make Locked On Bears your first listen once again for another opportunity to bear down.